But there is a sense that what God has done through these last, not just the 72 years of my ministry, but particularly in the last 40, 50 years, is incredible. And so much of it has come because of that desire in my heart. And when I had the desire in my heart, it's a little bit like David, I didn't visualize exactly how it would be done. All I was determined was that that would be my life's work. But now David comes to the place where God has said to him, in verse 3, God said, "You shall not do this because you're a man of war and you've shed blood." However, David goes on to say, "The Lord God of Israel has chosen me before all the house of my father to be king over Israel." I mean, this comes back to something quite remarkable, because when Saul went to David's father's house, because God had sent him there to anoint the king over Israel, David's father Jesse brought all the sons before before Samuel. And yet they were rejected. And it was only when Samuel is still determined to find the right one that Jesse sends for the outcast. And David was the outcast who didn't live in the blessing of his father's mansion, but was keeping the sheep. And what I realize is that David was actually an illegitimate son. Now, I know the Jews don't like me to mention this. They find it offensive, but I find it the evidence quite strong. And doesn't David actually say, "In sin did my mother conceive me"? So you can understand that largely because of this background, David is all the more determined to do something for God. And so he's saying that God chose him above anybody else in his family. And then, because God had given him many sons, and in verse 5 he's saying, "Of all my sons, for the Lord has given me many, many sons," God has chosen one, Solomon, to sit upon the throne of Israel. And then in verse 6, I see something really interesting. Because God is saying to David, "Solomon, your son, he shall build my house and my courts. For I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father." Do you know, this is the only place in Scripture, I find this so intriguing, this is the only place in the Bible where you see such a relationship that God actually says, that's the Old Testament, it's nothing to do with the New Testament. This is Old Testament. God is saying to David, your son Solomon is so important, so key, that he shall be to me as a son. This is so significant because we know Jesus was the Son of God and the only Son. But here, it's almost as if Solomon was a forerunner, and I don't want to go too deeply into this because of Solomon's sins and his failures. But it's something that really touched me, because I felt that what God was saying to me was this: in this case, you're not David, you're Solomon. And it's as if all those years ago, and you know, I can reminisce, and I think I'm entitled to at age 90. And looking back, it's as if God said this to me: you shall be as my son, and I will be to you as a father. And then verse 7, of course, I will establish his kingdom forever if he be constant to do my commandments and my judgments. So in verse 8, now therefore in the sight of all Israel and the congregation of the Lord and the audience of our God, keep and seek for all the commandments of the Lord your God, that you may possess this good land and leave it for an inheritance for your children after them. This is key thing about inheritance. And Solomon, my son, know the God of your father and serve him with a perfect heart and a willing mind. So you see the tremendous responsibility of the call that was on Solomon. But it's also interesting because what David goes on to do then is, first of all, in verse 10, he says, take heed because the Lord has chosen you to build an house for the sanctuary. Be strong and do it. Sometimes I feel the Lord saying that to me, get on with the job that I've called you to do, be strong and do it. And, you know, this is a driving motive with me. God is saying to me, be strong, do it, get on and do the job. And this has been probably the driving motive behind me all these, certainly 50, 60 years, and also a driving force now as I'm passing my 90th birthday. It is even stronger in me now than it was then. And that's why I'm referring back to it. But then what you find is this, from verse 11, David gave to Solomon his son the pattern of the porch. So, what is in David's heart, he passes on to his son, because David was so determined to do this that he'd got all the preparation, you know, the architects and all the plans and everything, and he goes on with the details of all. But then you'll find out that if you read this through carefully, the thing which really touched me was that David was giving to his son three things. In order for him to fulfill this job, David was giving his son the men, the money, and the materials. And you'll find out that that's literally, as you read it through, and time doesn't permit me just in this short message to go through the whole thing, but literally, David had prepared in advance these three issues. He'd prepared the materials because he gave him the gold and the silver and everything. It lists what he gave. And I mean, even to the extent, and if you look back, verse 14 of this chapter, he gave gold by weight for the things of gold, for all the instruments, silver also for the instruments of silver, and even the weight of the candlesticks of gold, and for their lamps of gold, and for the weight of every candlestick, and the lamps and the candlesticks of silver by weight. So in verse 16, and by weight he gave gold and of silver. And in verse 17, pure gold. And it had to be pure gold, and it refers to the type of gold. And everything, it's incredible. And he ends up by saying, in verse 19, all this, said David, the Lord made me to understand in writing by his hand all the works of this pattern. And then David says to Solomon his son, be strong and of a good courage and do it.